A lonely widow adopted a dying dog, never realizing it would lead her to true love again. The phrase echoed in Eleanor's mind as she stared at the small cardboard sign propped against the animal shelter's front desk. She'd come here on impulse, driven by the silence of her empty home, a silence that had grown deafening in the 3 years since Richard's passing. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the edge of her wedding ring, still firmly in place despite everything. "Did you have any particular animal in mind?" The receptionist's voice startled Eleanor from her thoughts. "No, She hesitated, uncertain why she was even here. At 62, with her carefully ordered life and quiet routines, what business did she have adopting a pet? "I'm just looking, I suppose." The young woman smiled kindly. "Well, take your time. The kennels are through that door, and the cat room is to the left." Eleanor nodded and moved toward the kennels, her sensible shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. The sound of barking grew louder, and something tightened in her chest, anticipation or anxiety, she couldn't tell which. The kennels smelled of disinfectant and damp fur. Most of the dogs rushed to the fronts of their enclosures, tails wagging in frantic hope. Eleanor passed them slowly, offering small smiles but feeling overwhelmed by their energy. At the very end of the row, in a kennel slightly apart from the others, lay a medium-sized dog with patchy copper-colored fur. Unlike the others, this one made no move to approach, watching her with tired amber eyes that seemed to hold the weight of years beyond their actual time. A small whiteboard hanging on the kennel door read, "Max, 7 years. Terminal cancer. Special adoption." Eleanor stopped. Something about those weary eyes pulled at her, reminded her of her own reflection on the mornings when getting out of bed seemed an insurmountable task. "That's Max." A deep voice spoke behind her. Eleanor turned to find a tall, bearded man in a blue shelter uniform. His name tag read, "Dr. James Cooper, veterinarian." "Terminal?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible above the barking. "Doctor." Cooper nodded, his expression softening. "Pancreatic cancer. He has maybe 4 to 6 months. He was surrendered last week when his family couldn't afford the care." He hesitated. "Most people pass right by this kennel once they read that sign." Eleanor looked back at the dog. Max had lifted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. Something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of shared solitude. "What kind of care does he need?" she asked. The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise the veterinarian. "Pain management, mostly. Special diet. Regular checkups." He studied her carefully. "It's not easy taking on an animal you know you'll lose soon." Eleanor's fingers found her wedding ring again, twisting it once. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." 30 minutes later, Eleanor sat in her car in the shelter parking lot, paperwork signed, a leash on the passenger seat, and a prescription for Max's medications in her purse. What had she done? A widow in her 60s, living alone, adopting a dying dog? Richard would have called it impulsive, something the old Eleanor would never have done. Perhaps that was precisely why she had done it. Max's arrival transformed Eleanor's neat colonial house in ways both subtle and profound. His bed in the corner of her living room, the pill containers lined up beside her own on the kitchen counter, the soft click of his nails against the hardwood floors. The first night he slept curled beside her bed, not on it. By the third night he'd climbed up beside her, his warm body a comforting weight against her leg, the first living presence to share her bed since Richard. Eleanor spoke to Max constantly. At first she felt foolish, a lonely old woman talking to a dog as if he were a person. But soon it became as natural as breathing. "What do you think of this sweater, Max? Too blue?" she'd ask, holding up items from her closet. Or, setting out her breakfast, "I suppose you'd like a bite of my toast, wouldn't you? Just one small piece, mind you." She told him about Richard, how they'd met at university, his passion for architectural history, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. She found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, not even their daughter Claire, who lived 3 states away with grandchildren too busy for regular visits. "He died on a Tuesday," she told Max one evening as they sat on the back porch, watching fireflies rise from the garden. "Isn't that strange? Such an ordinary day for something so enormous. I was making chicken piccata, his favorite. He was upstairs changing out of his work clothes. By the time I found him, the sauce had separated." Max rested his head on her knee, his eyes fixed on her face. "I still haven't made chicken piccata since," she whispered, stroking his ears. "Silly, isn't it?" The daily walks with Max became Eleanor's lifeline, forcing her outside the 4 walls that had become both sanctuary and prison. She mapped out routes of varying lengths, depending on Max's energy level. Some days they managed only to the end of the driveway. Other days they ventured all the way to Maple Street Park. It was on one of these better days, 3 weeks after bringing Max home, that Eleanor first noticed the man at the park, tall and lean, with silver-streaked dark hair, throwing a ball for a sleek black Labrador. Max stopped, watching the ball arc through the air with obvious interest. "Would you like to try?" Eleanor asked softly, though she worried about taxing his strength. Max's tail gave a tentative wag, the most enthusiasm he'd shown since coming home with her. Eleanor hesitated, then steered them toward an empty section of the park, away from the man and his energetic dog. She found a tennis ball in the grass, left behind by some other pet owner, and gently tossed it a short distance for Max. To her surprise and delight, Max trotted after it, carried it back, and dropped it at her feet. His eyes held a spark she hadn't seen before, and something swelled in Eleanor's chest. Hope, perhaps. That dangerous emotion. "Well done," she said, bending to pick up the slick green ball. When she straightened, she found herself looking directly at the silver-haired man, now standing just a few feet away. "Sorry to intrude," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "But I couldn't help noticing your dog. He has the same coloring as my childhood pet." Eleanor felt herself stiffen. She wasn't in the habit of speaking to strangers, especially male ones. Another change since Richard, that constant, low-level wariness. "Yes, he's a lovely color," she replied, her tone polite but distant. She turned slightly, a clear signal that the conversation was over. But Max, normally so sensitive to her moods, did the unexpected. He walked directly to the stranger and nudged the man's hand with his nose. "Max," Eleanor called, embarrassed. The man crouched down, bringing himself to Max's level. "Hello there, fellow," he said softly, looking to Eleanor for permission before gently stroking Max's head. Something about the gentleness of the gesture, the careful way the man's weathered hand moved over Max's fur, made Eleanor pause. "I'm Daniel," he said, looking up at her with eyes the color of faded denim. "And that impatient creature over there is Sadie." He nodded toward the black lab, who was chasing shadows near a park bench. "Eleanor," she replied, surprising herself. "And this is Max." Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his solemn face. "Nice to meet you both." He stood, knees cracking slightly. Eleanor guessed him to be close to her age, perhaps a few years older. If Max is feeling up to it, Sadie would love a playmate. "She has more energy than is reasonable for a dog her age." Eleanor hesitated. Max's nudge against her leg seemed to urge her forward. "Maybe for a few minutes?" she conceded. "Max tires easily. He's—" She trailed off, uncertain how to explain. Daniel nodded as if he understood anyway. "We'll keep it gentle." They walked together to a grassy area where Sadie bounded over, immediately interested in the newcomers. To Eleanor's relief, the lab seemed to intuitively sense Max's limitations, toning down her exuberance to match his pace as they sniffed and circled each other. "She was my wife's dog," Daniel said, watching the animals with a small smile. "Margot trained her well, better than I ever could have." The past tense hung in the air between them, an unspoken understanding. "Margot passed 3 years ago," he added quietly. "Cancer." Eleanor's throat tightened. "My husband Richard. Heart attack. Also 3 years ago." Daniel nodded, and they stood in silence, watching their dogs get acquainted in the warm afternoon light. No platitudes, no awkward expressions of sympathy, just the simple recognition of shared experience. When Max lay down in the grass, clearly tired, Eleanor knew it was time to leave. "It was nice meeting you," she said, meaning it more than she'd expected to. "We're here most afternoons," Daniel replied. "Weather permitting." It wasn't quite an invitation, but it felt like one. Eleanor nodded and clicked her tongue for Max. As they walked away, she resisted the urge to look back. Eleanor hadn't planned to return to the park the next day, but by mid-afternoon, with rain clouds gathering and Max looking restless, she found herself reaching for his leash. "Just a quick walk before the storm," she told him, not acknowledging even to herself that she was choosing the route that led to Maple Street Park. Daniel was there, sitting on a bench reading a paperback while Sadie dozed at his feet. He looked up as they approached, and the smile that crossed his face sent an unexpected flutter through Eleanor's chest. A sensation so long dormant, she almost didn't recognize it. "I was hoping you might come back," he said, marking his place in the book with a receipt. Over the next few weeks, their park meetings became a routine. Sometimes they walked together around the perimeter path. Sadie's energetic pace slowed to accommodate Max. Other days, when Max was too tired, they sat on the bench while the dogs rested side by side in the grass. Daniel, she learned, had been a professor of literature at the small liberal arts college in town before retiring the previous year. He'd come to America from Austria as a young man, which explained the accent she'd detected. He and Margot had no children, not for lack of trying. He'd said with a gentle sadness that Eleanor understood all too well. She told him about Claire and her grandchildren, about her 30 years teaching elementary school, about the garden she'd let go wild after Richard died. "I used to love gardening," she admitted one day. "Richard built me raised beds for my birthday one year. I grew the most beautiful tomatoes." "Why did you stop?" Daniel asked, his voice free of judgment. Eleanor stared at the patterns of light and shadow on the path. "It seemed pointless, growing all that food just for me." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Perhaps the joy was never about who would eat the tomatoes. The words stayed with Eleanor long after she'd returned home. That evening, she found herself standing at the edge of her backyard, looking at the overgrown beds, the collapsed trellises, the garden shed Richard had painted a cheery red, now faded to a dull rust color. Max stood beside her, leaning slightly against her leg in that way he had, as if offering support. "Should we try, Max?" she whispered. "A small garden just for us?" The next morning, she called Claire. "Mom?" Her daughter sounded surprised. Eleanor realized with a pang how rarely she initiated their calls now. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, dear. I was wondering, do you still have your father's gardening tools in your shed? The good Japanese ones?" Silence stretched across the phone line. "You're gardening again?" Eleanor felt a flicker of defensiveness. "I thought I might try." That's wonderful, Mom. Of course you can have the tools. I could ship them, or maybe..." Claire hesitated. "Maybe we could bring them? The kids have a long weekend coming up." The thought of her home filled with noise and movement, grandchildren racing through the quiet rooms, Claire's probing eyes noticing everything that Eleanor had let slide. It was both tempting and terrifying. "That would be lovely," she heard herself say. After hanging up, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, heart racing as if she'd run a marathon. Max rested his head on her knee, his amber eyes watching her with what seemed like approval. "I've stirred things up now, haven't I?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "All because of you." At their next park meeting, Eleanor told Daniel about Claire's impending visit. "That's wonderful," he said, genuine warmth in his voice. Then, noticing her expression, "Isn't it?" Eleanor sighed. "It is. It's just, they haven't visited in almost 2 years. Not since the first anniversary of Richard's death. The house is a mess. I'm a mess." She hadn't meant to admit that last part. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said finally, "I'm fairly handy. If you needed help getting anything ready, repairs, heavy lifting, I'd be happy to lend a hand." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't accept help easily, never had. Richard used to tease her about her stubborn independence. But before she could decline, Max stood up and walked over to Daniel, resting his head on the man's knee in exactly the way he did with Eleanor when she was upset. Daniel looked as surprised as she felt. "Well," he said softly, "that's quite an endorsement." Something shifted in Eleanor's chest. "Maybe you could look at the garden shed," she said. "The door sticks terribly." Daniel's smile illuminated his entire face. "I'd be honored." The next day, Daniel arrived at Eleanor's house with a small toolbox and Sadie on a leash. Eleanor had spent the morning in a flurry of tidying, then chided herself for it. This wasn't a social call, he was just helping with the shed. Still, she'd put on a nicer sweater than usual, and had even swiped on a bit of lipstick before wiping it off, feeling foolish. Max greeted their visitors with more enthusiasm than Eleanor had seen from him yet, his tail wagging steadily as he led them through the house to the back door as if he'd orchestrated this meeting himself. "Your home is beautiful," Daniel said, glancing around at the high ceilings and built-in bookshelves that had sold Eleanor and Richard on the house 30 years ago. "So much character?" "Richard loved old houses," Eleanor replied, leading him to the kitchen and through the back door. "He could tell you the history of every architectural detail." They stood side by side on the back porch, surveying the once lovely yard. The flower beds were choked with weeds, the vegetable garden reduced to a tangle of chicken wire and rotting wooden frames. "Richard built all of that," Eleanor said, gesturing to the raised beds. "He wasn't naturally handy, but he took a woodworking class just so he could make them properly." Daniel nodded, his eyes taking in everything. He sounds like a remarkable man. He was. The words came out softer than she intended. The shed is over there. As they crossed the yard, Eleanor felt strangely vulnerable, showing this neglected piece of herself to someone new. The garden's decay seemed like a physical manifestation of her grief, something she'd allowed to happen, day by day, too exhausted to fight against the slow surrender. The garden shed's door had swollen with moisture, making it nearly impossible to open. Daniel examined it carefully, testing the hinges and frame. "The wood has warped," he said. "I'll need to plane down the edge a bit. Do you have any tools I might use?" Eleanor shook her head. "Claire is bringing Richard's tools next week. I have nothing but an ancient hammer somewhere in the kitchen drawer." Daniel smiled. "Not to worry. I can come back tomorrow with what we need." He ran his hand along the faded paint. "We could repaint it too if you'd like. Bring back that red." Eleanor looked at the shed. Richard in paint-splattered clothes, laughing as he worked. The children helping, their small hands covered in red. Summer evenings sitting beside it on lawn chairs, watching fireflies rise from the garden beds. "Yes," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I'd like that very much." They ended up sitting on the back porch with glasses of iced tea, watching the dogs explore the yard. Max showed Sadie his favorite spots, the sunny patch near the bird feeder, the shady area beneath the old oak tree. "He seems stronger today," Daniel observed. Eleanor nodded. "He has good days and bad. The medication helps with the pain, but—" She trailed off, the unspoken reality hanging between them. Daniel's eyes met hers, filled with understanding. "How are you managing with that? Knowing what's coming?" No one had asked her that before. Not about Max, not about Richard. People asked how she was doing, of course, but never with such directness, such acknowledgement of the grief that was both present and anticipated. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Some days I can push it away. Other days—" She watched Max, now lying contentedly in a patch of sunlight. "Other days I wonder if I made a mistake, opening myself up to another loss so soon." Daniel nodded, his gaze following hers to the dogs. "After Margot died, I promised myself I wouldn't get another pet. Sadie was already 11. I told myself she'd be my last. I couldn't bear the thought of loving something else I would lose." He took a sip of tea. "But then I realized that's what Margot would have hated most, the idea that her death would make me stop reaching for connection." Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Richard would say the same," she whispered. They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light softened around them. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Eleanor asked suddenly. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise Daniel. "Nothing fancy, just soup and sandwiches." Daniel's smile reached all the way to his eyes. "I'd like that very much." The next few days fell into an unexpected pattern. Daniel would arrive mid-morning with his tools and work on the shed, while Eleanor began the slow process of reclaiming the garden beds. They'd break for lunch, sitting on the porch or at the kitchen table, talking about books they'd loved, places they'd visited, the small moments that had shaped their lives. Eleanor found herself sharing stories about Richard that she hadn't voiced in years, not the sanitized version of grief that she presented to Claire, but the complex reality of a 38-year marriage with all its joy and friction. "He could be infuriatingly stubborn," she admitted one afternoon as they ate sandwiches in the shade. "Once he got an idea in his head, there was no talking him out of it." Daniel laughed. "Margot was exactly the same. She decided to repaint our entire house one summer while I was at an academic conference. I came home to find every room a different color." "Did you hate it?" Eleanor asked. "I thought I would," Daniel replied, smiling at the memory. "But she knew me better than I knew myself. Every color was perfect. Colors I never would have chosen, but that somehow reflected exactly what each room needed." His expression softened. That was Margot's gift, seeing the truth of things beneath the surface. By the fourth day, the shed door was fixed, and they had started on the painting. Eleanor found herself laughing as Daniel dripped red paint down his shirt, his mock outrage making her ribs ache with a joy she'd nearly forgotten. Max seemed to draw energy from their project, supervising from a comfortable spot nearby, occasionally getting up to inspect their progress with what Eleanor swore was a critical eye. "Your dog is a perfectionist," Daniel teased as Max nudged his leg when he missed a spot. "He comes by it honestly," Eleanor replied. "You should have seen Richard measuring twice, cutting once. Everything had to be just so." On Friday afternoon, with the shed nearly finished, Eleanor made tea and brought it out to where Daniel was adding final touches to the trim. "Claire arrives tomorrow," she said, setting his mug on the small table they'd unearthed from the shed. She'll be shocked to see all this progress. Daniel set down his brush and took the mug gratefully. Will you tell her about Max's condition? Eleanor sighed. I suppose I'll have to. She'll notice the medication, the special food. She watched Max, who was napping peacefully in a way that made her heart both full and heavy. I'm not looking forward to that conversation. She'll think I'm setting myself up for more pain. And what do you think? Daniel asked gently. Eleanor considered the question, watching the steam rise from her tea. I think, she paused, searching for words. I think that loving him, even knowing I'll lose him, is worth the pain that's coming. I think that's what it means to be alive. Daniel's eyes held hers, something profound passing between them. Yes, he said softly. That's exactly what it means. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Max stirred, breaking the spell as he came over to press against Eleanor's leg. I should get home, Daniel said, gathering his paintbrushes. Let you prepare for tomorrow. Eleanor nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of Claire's impending visit, the questions that would come, the explanations she'd need to give about the garden, about Max, about the red shed that now stood bright against the afternoon sun, about Daniel. Thank you, she said, walking him to the gate. For everything. Daniel smiled, that wonderful transformation of his solemn face. I'll check in after your family leaves. See how you're holding up. Eleanor watched him walk down the street, Sadie trotting beside him, until they turned the corner and disappeared from view. Claire arrived the next morning with her husband, Tom, and the twins, now lanky 13-year-olds with devices perpetually in hand. The car had barely stopped in the driveway before Eleanor's daughter was examining her with that clinical gaze that always made Eleanor feel like a specimen under glass. You look better, Mom, Claire said, embracing her. You've got some color in your cheeks. Before Eleanor could respond, Max appeared at the door, and chaos ensued. The twins, Lily and Lucas, immediately abandoned their phones to crouch beside him, exclaiming over his soft ears and gentle eyes. You got a dog? Claire's surprise was evident. When did this happen? About a month ago, Eleanor replied, ushering everyone inside. His name is Max. Tom carried in Richard's tool chest, heavier than Eleanor remembered, while Claire brought a suitcase and a box of what looked like school art projects. I found these in the attic, Claire explained. Your students' work that you saved. I thought you might like to have them back. Eleanor was touched by the gesture, more than she could express. She'd spent 30 years teaching third grade, saving special pieces from each class, until the collection grew too unwieldy and Claire had offered to store them. Thank you, dear, she said, running her hand over the box lid. That was thoughtful. As they settled into the living room, Max made his rounds, greeting each person with dignified interest before settling beside Eleanor's chair with a contented sigh. He's very well behaved, Tom commented, always one to appreciate good manners, canine or otherwise. He's wonderful, Eleanor agreed, meeting Claire's questioning gaze. He's also quite ill, I'm afraid. Terminal cancer. The room went still, even the twins looking up from where they sat on the floor. Oh, Mom, Claire said, her voice a mixture of concern and something else. Perhaps the confirmation of what she'd feared, that her mother was making unwise choices in her loneliness. Don't oh, Mom me, Eleanor said more sharply than she intended. She softened her tone. I knew what I was getting into. He needed a home for his final months, and She stroked Max's head. I needed him too. Claire exchanged a look with Tom. It's just, won't it be hard? After everything with Dad? Eleanor felt a familiar tightening in her throat, but she met her daughter's gaze steadily. Yes, it will be terribly hard, but that doesn't mean it isn't right. Before Claire could respond, Lucas spoke up from his spot on the floor. I think it's cool, Grandma. Giving him a good home even though he's sick. Lily nodded in solemn agreement. Like hospice, but for dogs. Eleanor felt a rush of affection for her grandchildren, their unaffected acceptance of both life's joys and sorrows. Exactly like that, she said. Now who's hungry? I've made lunch. Over sandwiches and fruit, the conversation moved to safer topics. The twins' activities, Tom's promotion, community news. It wasn't until they'd finished eating that Claire mentioned the backyard. I noticed the garden shed looks new, she said. Did you hire someone to fix it up? Eleanor felt a warmth creep into her cheeks. A friend helped me. Claire's eyebrows rose. A friend? Daniel, Eleanor said, busying herself with clearing plates. He's someone I met at the park while walking Max. He's good with tools. Daniel? Claire repeated, a note of cautious hope in her voice that made Eleanor both touched and irritated. Is he a neighbor? He lives a few blocks away, Eleanor replied, deliberately vague. He's been very kind, helping me get the garden ready for Richard's tools. Claire seemed to be weighing her words carefully. That's nice. Will we get to meet him? He's giving us family time, Eleanor said, rinsing a plate with perhaps more force than necessary. But perhaps another visit. She could feel Claire's eyes on her back, assessing, wondering. It reminded Eleanor of how she'd felt as a young widow with a small child, everyone watching, waiting to see how she would fail or succeed at navigating her grief. After lunch, they all went to the backyard to survey the garden progress. The twins immediately climbed the old oak tree, while Tom examined the shed with professional interest. This is quality work, he said, inspecting the hinges. Your friend knows what he's doing. Claire walked the perimeter of the cleared beds, her expression softening. You're really going to plant again? That's wonderful, Mom. Eleanor nodded, feeling a strange mix of pride and defensiveness. Just a few tomatoes to start. Maybe some herbs. Dad would be happy, Claire said quietly. Eleanor looked at her daughter, really looked at her for perhaps the first time since Richard's death. She saw the grief still etched in the fine lines around Claire's eyes, the way she carried tension in her shoulders. In focusing so intently on her own pain, Eleanor had sometimes forgotten that Claire had lost her father, her anchor. Yes, Eleanor said, reaching for her daughter's hand. He would be... Later, after dinner and games with the twins, after Tom and Claire had gone up to the guest room and the children were settled in sleeping bags in the living room, Eleanor sat on the back porch with Max. The newly painted shed glowed faintly in the moonlight, a beacon of renewal. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Daniel, checking in as promised. All well? He'd written. Standing by if reinforcements needed. Eleanor smiled in the darkness, typing back, surviving. Shed much admired. Will call tomorrow. She sat a while longer, Max's head heavy on her knee, listening to the night sounds and feeling something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that felt remarkably like hope. Sunday morning brought rain, soft and steady, tapping against the windows. Eleanor woke earlier than usual, momentarily disoriented by the sounds of other people in her home, the low murmur of Tom's voice, the twins' muffled laughter, the shower running in the guest bathroom. Max was not in his usual spot beside her. Concerned, she slipped on her robe and went downstairs to find him curled up with Lucas on the living room floor, both still asleep amid a nest of blankets. Claire was in the kitchen making coffee. Morning, Mom, she said quietly. Max made a friend. Eleanor smiled, watching her grandson's arm draped protectively over the dog. So I see. They stood in comfortable silence as the coffee brewed, rain pattering against the kitchen windows. Mom, Claire began, hesitancy in her voice. About Daniel. Eleanor tensed, preparing for questions or warnings. Yes? I'm glad, Claire said simply, that you've made a friend. The words were so unexpected that Eleanor found herself blinking back sudden tears. Thank you, dear, she managed. Claire poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Eleanor. Dad would want you to have people in your life. To be happy. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm mug. I know, she said softly. It's taken me a while to know that, but I do. They sat at the kitchen table as the house gradually woke around them, listening to the rain and sharing the comfortable silence that had been missing between them for too long. After breakfast, Claire helped Eleanor sort through the box of student artwork, exclaiming over pieces she remembered from her childhood visits to her mother's classroom. The twins took Max for a short walk between rain showers, carefully monitoring his energy as Eleanor had instructed. By mid-afternoon, the car was packed again, goodbyes being exchanged on the front porch. We'll come back soon, Claire promised, embracing Eleanor tightly. Maybe for Thanksgiving? We could help with the garden before winter sets in. Eleanor found herself nodding. I'd like that very much. She stood on the porch with Max beside her, waving until the car disappeared around the corner. The house felt strangely empty after the weekend's activity, but not in the hollow way it had before. Something had shifted, some bridge rebuilt between her present and her past. She called Daniel that evening. They're gone, she said when he answered. The house is still standing and so am I. His chuckle warmed her even through the phone. I never doubted it. How did it go? Better than expected, she admitted. Claire wants to come back for Thanksgiving. That's wonderful, Daniel said, genuine pleasure in his voice. Did you tell her about Max's condition? Yes, she understood, I think. More than I expected. Eleanor paused, watching Max sleeping peacefully on his bed. She asked about you too. Oh. There was a note of careful neutrality in his voice. And what did you tell her? Eleanor smiled to herself. That you're a friend who's been very kind. A fair assessment, Daniel replied, but she could hear the smile in his voice. I was thinking, Eleanor said, surprising herself with her boldness, perhaps you could join us for dinner tomorrow? As a thank you for all your help with the shed. The momentary silence on the other end of the line made her heart beat faster. I'd be honored, Daniel finally said, his voice warm. Shall I bring anything? Just yourself, Eleanor replied. And Sadie, if you like. Max would enjoy the company. After they hung up, Eleanor sat for a long time in her quiet living room, one hand resting on Max's sleeping form. Outside, the garden shed stood in the moonlight, its fresh red paint a promise of seasons to come. The dinner with Daniel marked a turning point. What had begun as park meetings and friendly assistance evolved into something deeper, more consistent. They fell into comfortable routines, Sunday walks with the dogs, Wednesday dinners at Eleanor's house, Saturday mornings at the farmer's market when Max was feeling strong enough. Together they brought Eleanor's garden back to life, planting late-season vegetables and preparing beds for spring bulbs. Daniel showed her how to build a simple cold frame using old windows he'd salvaged from a renovation project, extending her growing season. You're a natural, he told her as she skillfully transplanted lettuce seedlings. You must have gardened before. Eleanor nodded, patting soil around a delicate plant. My mother taught me when I was young. Then Richard and I always had a garden right up until... She trailed off, focusing intently on the task at hand. Daniel worked quietly beside her, seeming to understand when words were needed and when silence was the greater kindness. As September faded into October, Max's good days became less frequent. There were mornings when he could barely rise from his bed, his amber eyes clouded with pain. On those days, Eleanor would sit beside him for hours, reading aloud from the books Daniel had lent her, her hand never leaving Max's warm fur. Daniel often came by on these difficult days, bringing soup or bread, sometimes just sitting with them in companionable silence. You don't have to keep coming, Eleanor said one evening as they sat on the porch, Max sleeping fitfully inside. I know it's hard to watch. Daniel took her hand, something he'd never done before. His palm was warm and slightly rough against hers. I'm not going anywhere, he said simply. The first hard frost came in late October. Eleanor woke to find the garden silvered in white, the last of her tomato plants blackened by the cold. Max had a surprisingly good day, enthusiastically joining her to inspect the transformed landscape, his breath making clouds in the chilly air. When Daniel arrived that afternoon, he found them sitting on a blanket in a patch of pale sunshine, Eleanor reading aloud from The Secret Garden. Room for one more? He asked, Sadie waiting patiently at his side. Eleanor shifted over, and Daniel settled beside her on the blanket, his shoulder warm against hers. Max, who had grown increasingly attached to Daniel, moved so that he was touching them both, his head on Eleanor's knee, his body pressed against Daniel's leg. You're reading Burnett, Daniel observed. One of my favorites. Mine too, Eleanor replied, though I haven't read it since I taught 3rd grade. It was always my October book, something about the idea of things coming back to life just as the world outside was preparing for winter. Daniel smiled. Would you continue? I'd love to hear it. So Eleanor read, her voice growing stronger with each page as the afternoon sun slanted through the bare branches above them, casting dappled patterns on the blanket. Sadie dozed nearby, and Max watched them all with contented eyes. It was, Eleanor thought, as close to perfect happiness as she had felt in years. That night, after Daniel had gone home and the house was quiet, Max struggled to climb onto Eleanor's bed. His legs trembled with the effort, and the sight pierced Eleanor's heart. Let me help you, sweet boy, she whispered, gently lifting him onto the comforter. He settled against her side, his breathing labored. Eleanor stroked his head, reciting the words that had become their nightly ritual. You are the best dog in the world, and I am so glad you found me. In the morning, Max couldn't stand. The trip to the veterinary clinic passed in a blur of tears and gentle hands. The young vet, not James Cooper from the shelter, but someone new with kind eyes, confirmed what Eleanor already knew. The cancer had spread. Max was in pain. It was time. I'll leave you alone to say goodbye, the vet said. Take as long as you need. Eleanor sat on the floor of the examination room, Max's head in her lap. She should call Daniel, she thought distantly. He would want to be here. But her phone was in her purse and she couldn't bear to move, to disturb these last precious moments. "You changed everything," she whispered to Max, her tears falling onto his copper fur. "You brave, wonderful boy. You gave me back my life." Max's eyes, clouded with pain but still so soulful, watched her face. His tail moved once, a faint thump against the floor. Eleanor bent to kiss his forehead, inhaling his familiar scent. When the door opened, she expected the veterinarian. Instead, Daniel knelt beside her, his face lined with concern. "The clinic called me," he explained softly. "They found my number on Max's paperwork. I listed myself as an emergency contact when I brought him for his checkup last week." He touched her shoulder gently. "I hope that's all right." Eleanor couldn't speak, could only nod as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Daniel settled beside her on the floor, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand joining hers in stroking Max's fur. "He's been so brave," Daniel murmured. "Such a good dog." They sat together, creating a circle of love around the dog who had brought them into each other's lives. When Max's breathing became more labored, Eleanor nodded to Daniel, who quietly opened the door and signaled to the waiting veterinarian. "I'm ready," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she expected. The end, when it came, was peaceful. Max simply sighed once, his body relaxing as the pain finally left him. Eleanor felt the moment his spirit departed, a subtle but unmistakable change, like a candle being gently extinguished. Daniel drove her home afterward, neither of them speaking much. The house felt impossibly empty as they stepped inside. Max's bed in the corner, his water bowl by the back door, his medications lined up on the kitchen counter, each a reminder of his absence. Eleanor moved through the rooms like a sleepwalker, touching Max's things, trying to absorb the reality that he was gone. Daniel followed quietly, making tea, opening windows to let in the crisp autumn air. When Eleanor finally sank onto the sofa, her reserves of strength depleted, he sat beside her and took her hand. "I keep thinking," she said, her voice raw from crying, "about how little time we had with him. Just a few months. It doesn't seem fair." Daniel's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "No," he agreed. "It isn't fair. But think of what those months meant to him. A home where he was loved completely, right to the end." Eleanor leaned against him, allowing herself to be held as fresh tears came. "I knew this was coming," she whispered. "I just didn't expect it to hurt this much." Daniel's arms tightened around her. "That's because you loved him with your whole heart. The price of great love is great grief. They're two sides of the same precious coin." They sat together as afternoon faded into evening, sharing memories of Max, his dignified greeting of visitors, his critical supervision of their gardening efforts, the way he always seemed to know when one of them needed comfort. "Do you regret it?" Daniel asked softly as darkness fell. "Taking him in, knowing what was coming?" Eleanor considered the question, her head still resting against Daniel's shoulder. "No," she said finally. "I could never regret him. He brought me back to life. He brought me—" She hesitated. "He brought me to you." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he shifted, turning to face her, his expression serious in the dim light. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle, "I need to tell you something." Her heart stuttered. "Yes?" "The day at the park, when we first met, it wasn't a coincidence." He took a deep breath. "I'd seen you before at the shelter, the day you adopted Max. I was there picking up medication for Sadie and I overheard Dr. Cooper telling another staff member about you, how moved he was that you'd taken Max, knowing his prognosis." Eleanor sat very still, processing his words. "When I saw you at the park later that week," Daniel continued, "I recognized Max right away. I wanted to meet the woman who would open her heart that way." His eyes held hers. "I didn't plan anything beyond that moment. I just felt drawn to you." "Why are you telling me this now?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel reached for her hand again. "Because I don't want there to be secrets between us. Not now. Not after Max." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, his weathered and strong, hers with its wedding ring that suddenly felt like it belonged to another life, another woman. "I'm glad you told me," she said finally. "And glad you approached us that day." Daniel's relief was visible, his shoulders relaxing. "I've been wanting to tell you for weeks, but it never seemed the right time." Eleanor nodded, understanding. Then slowly, she reached up to touch his face, a gesture of such intimacy that it surprised them both. "Thank you," she whispered. "For being here today?" "For everything." Daniel turned his face slightly, pressing a gentle kiss into her palm. The gesture was so tender, so full of unspoken feeling, that Eleanor felt something break loose inside her, a final wall of resistance crumbling. When he leaned forward to kiss her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if they had been moving toward this moment from the first day in the park, or perhaps even before that. Spring came earlier than usual that year, the cherry trees lining Eleanor's street bursting into pink blooms by mid-March. The garden beds, carefully prepared the previous fall, now sprouted with new growth, lettuce and peas, radishes and carrots, all arranged in tidy rows. Eleanor moved among them with a watering can, her steps lighter than they had been in years. From the back porch, Daniel watched her, a mug of coffee in his hand and Sadie dozing at his feet. "The tomato seedlings are getting leggy," Eleanor called to him. "We should transplant them this weekend." Daniel smiled at the "we," still a wonder to him, even after these months together. "Whatever you say, Professor," he replied. "You're the expert gardener in this relationship." Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying on the morning breeze. Her hair, once pulled back in a severe bun, now fell in a silver bob that caught the sunlight. The wedding ring she'd worn for 40 years now rested in a small box on her dresser, not forgotten, but no longer needed as a shield against the world. "Claire called this morning," she said, setting down the watering can and joining Daniel on the porch. "They'll be here for Easter weekend. The twins are excited about camping in the backyard." Daniel handed her a mug of coffee. "I'll set up the tent on Thursday then. Make sure there are no spiders to traumatize our granddaughter." The word "our" hung in the air between them, new and tentative. Eleanor's relationship with Daniel had evolved slowly after Max's death, careful steps towards something that neither of them had expected to find again at their age. They'd kept separate homes, but the boundaries had gradually blurred. Daniel's books now mingled with Eleanor's on the shelves. His reading glasses could be found on her nightstand. Sadie had a bed in Eleanor's living room, just as Max once had, and in the garden, nestled beneath the old oak tree, a small copper plaque read simply, "Max's Garden, where love grows again." Eleanor followed Daniel's gaze to the plaque, which gleamed in the morning light. "He would have loved spring," she said softly. Daniel's arm slipped around her waist. "He's here in every bloom," he replied. "In every new beginning." Eleanor leaned against him, watching as a pair of cardinals flitted among the cherry blossoms. She thought of the lonely woman who had walked into the animal shelter almost a year ago, searching for something she couldn't name: a dying dog, an unexpected friendship, a second chance at love. The garden path that had seemed so tangled and overgrown had led her here, to this moment of quiet joy. "Yes," she said, turning her face up to the sun. "He is."